We are going to jump straight into our plenary. As you can see, we've got lovely Maya joining us, and we do have William, who's going to be part of the plenary as well. So if you do have any questions for each individual, please write in your question if it's a targeted question towards a particular individual or if it's for the collective as well. I'm going to kick it off. And my question is actually going to be for yourself, Lynn, and for William. With 2020 being the year that it was in highlighting for Australia broadly, as well as the world, as to a lot of the inequities that are currently being faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and have been faced for a very long time since colonisation. Why is it so important for people to acknowledge and celebrate the resilience and the strength of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the face of these inequities while talking about them?
I'll just say that for me, it's about recognising strength and talent, and that we spend so much time on identifying the social gaps, which is really important. But what get lost in that is the strengths and talents that we have and the connections to country that's ignored. And I think that that's what we need to be looking at and celebrating, what it is that would makes us unique in the world and makes Australia unique.
Well, the truth be known is that for 230 or 50 whatever years since colonisation, I mean, this country's stuffed. I mean, nature itself is telling you that. And to survive in a country 65,000 years, you must have had some relationship with nature. You must have understood nature to the extent that you could not only thrive, you could survive. And to do that, I mean, there's a lesson to be learned in this, is that in the name of progress, we've stuffed up this place. And quite frankly, it's not a good picture. You know, I'm talking about global warming and all the other things. I mean, in regards to pandemics, I mean, the way we lived was the best version of social distancing you could ever have. You know, you didn't live in village-style situations. You didn't have the infrastructure that villages had. You were nomadic. You moved and you followed the seasons. You know, you lived that life. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's one of the reasons why the common flu and smallpox decimated a lot of our people at the advent of colonisation. So we had it right in a lot of ways. It's just that it was never recognised, and you know, it's going to come around again. It's high time that people started learning and accepting that Aboriginal people learned to live in this harsh country. And in some areas, I mean, there were some areas where there was plentiful, and you know, you could hunt for an hour and spend 23 hours discussing the meaning of life. I mean, that was in some areas, but up here in the top end and in the deserts, I mean, food wasn't that readily available, but you survived because you knew, you understood, you were a participant observer of nature. You knew what a flower would bloom would indicate that there certain behaviours were happening, and you know, you could harvest that the products of that. But yeah, I think Australia needs to stop and think about what value the Australian Aboriginal people have given to this country, and have need to start thinking about that, because it survived.
Absolutely. And I think the fact that this year was the first in a long time that they have led the backburning and the practices to try to prevent another kind of season of those immense fires that we had last summer. They're leading that with Aboriginal burning practices. And it's the first time in ages that that's how they've started it, rather than kind of the last fire season. It was actually towards the end that they were like, oh, actually, we've been hearing from our Aboriginal community members that this is a way to kind of protect ourselves. So let's do this as a kind of like a back step. So it is really powerful in regards to our knowledge systems. I mean, we're the first bakers, we're the first builders, we're the first farmers and fishermen and women, and there's proof of that. So absolutely, and thank you for that. On that note, in how we can kind of try to make this place that we call home a bit better. Maya, you touched on earlier the Learn Our Truths campaign, and William, you were talking about the organisation Children's Ground. I was wondering if you guys could talk to different campaigns, such as what In My Blood It Runs is also doing with its impact. What kind of impacts can people today start following, looking into, or learn more about, so that, if anything, starting today, we can make this change a positive one?
Thanks, Zoe. I think it would be really lovely just to share with everyone a bit about the Learn Our Truth campaign. So that's one of the things that we're backing a new group called National Indigenous Youth Education Coalition, NIEC, which is run by Hayley Maguire and Renee Phillips and a whole lot of other young First Nations teachers and educators. And it's all about supporting, I suppose to go back a bit, they run NIAC and we're backing this campaign Learn Our Truth with another organisation called B. And they'll be running over this year, and it's kind of like asking teachers, educators, principals to take a pledge to teach the true history in their schools. And I think that's because NIAC have been doing research over the last 2 years, listening to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people about how they want to reclaim their education, and also noting that the actual curriculum outcomes are there to teach the true history. But what's not there is giving teachers and educators the support to be able to do this work well. It's not necessarily mandatory in university degrees to understand that true history. And teachers have, you know, to be honest, it's really full on and hard, and you're so stretched as a teacher. So how do you do this work well when we're not holding people's hands and supporting them? Yeah. So the campaign is sort of about making this pledge and then supporting with resources to do that work well in schools. And right now they're crowdfunding, so to be able to do that work. So if you go to learnourtruth.com, you can read all about the campaign and what they plan for the year, and lots of collaborations, obviously, with everyone working in this space and linking out to the incredible work that already exists to help teachers to do the work well.
Brilliant. And we always need more resources. So please hit up learnourtruth.com so you can get your hands on some of those and hear from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people directly, because I think that's also something that's typically left, is people sometimes go, well, I tried getting in touch with community and haven't heard back, or I've never met an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person is still a thing. So having organisations and spaces, and that we've got this wonderful internet, despite us having some tech issues today, that we can access resources and information at the ready. But relationships that Lynn, you were talking about earlier, that relationship building is so important. Going to community for those conversations, if you're wanting to teach anything about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's stuff and things, is so important as well to get that perspective.
I think one of the key issues with that is understanding the resources that you do have access to. So one of the key things that I teach my students to do is how to analyse resources for cultural bias, because so many resources have been produced outside of Aboriginal people and reinterpreted, specifically by, you know, a lot of anthropologists in the past who were also white men. So a lot of Aboriginal women didn't or weren't able to give the information across. For example, I just recently had somebody say to me, Aboriginal women have never had a role in corroborees. And it was like, really? Because I read it by an anthropologist, so it must be true. So you need to be able to challenge what's currently there, and you need to be able to understand that everything has to be in context. And I have concerns that often there is still, you know, sacred stuff that has been produced without Aboriginal people having the veto right.
Yeah.
So that engagement with Aboriginal people, so just contacting an Aboriginal person and automatically assuming that you are going to have the right to pump their brain, it's about a relationship.
Absolutely.
You need to develop a relationship, but you also need to localise it. You know, just because you've learned some Aboriginal art practices from the Northern Territory doesn't mean that has to be reproduced down south. What is it that people right across country are producing?
Absolutely.
Shell work, X-ray art, sculptures, carvings, emu, wood, emu eggs, you know? Like there's so much out there. But you need to go and find it and talk with Aboriginal people and find out what's available in your local area. That's localising the curriculum. And it's about understanding specific cultural practices, not just that there's one cultural practice and everybody does it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The diversity, if you haven't seen it yet, in your presentation, you did have a snippet of the AI Axis map of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia, the diversity within that. And that is, once again, we didn't have whole maps of Australia. So those boundaries are still, unfortunately, in contention for a number of communities. And the diversity is still probably even richer than is illustrated in that map. But it showcases the diversity across the country and the fact that we used nature, which is now has man-made constructions built over top of it, means that our boundaries have had to kind of shift and navigate, and conversations are still needed to be had. So that multiple perspective within community as well as within your research and wanting to bring resources is still very, very important as well.
And it doesn't mean the cultural connections are dead because there's a building over the top of it.
No.
We still know those cultural connections.
Absolutely.
And so that's another.
Yeah. No matter where
story.
you are, no matter where you are in Australia, you are on Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander land, because it always was and it always will be Aboriginal land. That connection to Mother, to Earth, is still going to be there, because for us, we are the land and the land is us. That connection doesn't just flow between people, it flows between country, it flows between sky, it flows between water. So that is also very poignant. So concrete won't stop us being connected, just saying. Yes, are there any other questions?
There's a question from Megan, who talks about the film In My Blood It Runs. At the start of the film, Duan says, "I was born with a memory." And she asks, what can teachers and other practitioners learn from this statement?
Ooh. So is that a general question? Megan hasn't said she's trying it? Okay.
I don't mind just explaining a little bit about that phrase first, and then maybe
Please
I'll
do.
open it to the others. But so Duan, very early on in filming, said that he turned to me and said, I've got a memory of history in my blood it runs. So the title comes from Duan of the film. And I think what is very beautiful is that, you know, Duan is so young, but he, you know, was able to articulate what it feels like to carry that weight of history. And he doesn't, you know every single detail or date or scientific understanding of what has happened before him, but he could feel the strength of his ancestors walking with him, and he feels that weight because he sees it in the sadness of, you know, his mother, of what happens when she talks about the history, or of grandparents, or of stolen generations. That's something that's happened right up close. So it's very, I think it's very intuitive, and we decided to title the film that. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else would like to comment on it. I like as well that for him it's a memory. That's his words. It's not history. It's memories that lives in his blood.
And I guess memory goes across race, it goes across cultures. We all know what memory is and the power of memories in connecting us, in reconnecting us. So it is a wonderful and beautiful statement that he made, and very, very powerful. So great question, Megan.
William, did you want to add anything to that about
I
the
just
title of the film and about how
that the film itself,
about the title, about the memory of and how history runs in Duan's blood, your blood, everyone's blood.
yeah, the film itself seems to have two silent components in it, and there was this ever-present threat of Don Dale around every corner, and that's one of the reasons why Grandma and Mum went out every night looking for him diligently, because they knew that threat existed. It doesn't say that threat is there, but it's there in the film, and you can feel that surveillance and scrutiny is very much part of Duan's life in regards to him being part of a modern, so-called modern society that's run on commerce and tourism. The other side is this, I have this dream of this memory of being an Aboriginal, of being thing, because that history is there. It's not expressed in any other way. It's very articulated by Duan in that statement, but it's not something that it's there. It's forever present as well. That I am an Aboriginal, but I know that in this town, I'm also walking a thin line. And I find that that's one of the most sort of fascinating aspects or facet of this whole film, is that exists. You can read between the lines when you watch the film that on two hands he's Aboriginal, but because he's Aboriginal, around the corner there's a whole heap of danger in regards to what the system will do to him if they ever got a chance to get hold of him. And that's one of the reasons why Mum and Grandmother did what they did.
And that's why in the film as well, we decided to give visual reference to Duan's idea of memory by using archive in a quite, I suppose, cinematic way, where you see that history of both strengths and, you know, the harrowing truth of colonisation, which is cut through his memory in moments throughout the film, where we have like flashes where you don't know what each piece of footage is from, but it is something that sort of sits in our subconscious.
It just strengthens that view that he knows. The other thing that he knows is the difference between them and us. When he stood on that hill and he said, I wish I had a house like that. I wish I lived in green suburbs like that instead of living on a town camp. He could see the difference. He knew that. He was very articulate in the way that he portrayed that. But he also knew that he was walking that thin line of heading to Don Dale. But Mum and Grandmother knew that more acutely.
And the crazy thing is that Duan was just being a 10-year-old kid in the film. It wasn't like he was doing anything dangerous or reckless. He was just being a kid. But because of the fact that he was Aboriginal, he was under more scrutiny. And that is the truth of it. It's like, you don't have to be doing anything wrong. You just have to be seen as doing something wrong by being your essential self. And that was what really stood out for me, being a new mum, was the fact that I don't want my daughter to have to go through that kind of scrutiny just because she's Aboriginal. And that is still happening. The fact that the incarceration rates and all that are still so young, and that we are still so overrepresented in juvenile justice and in prison systems that are supposed to be upholding society and law in positive ways, and they're not. They're actually just increasing the gap between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Indigenous peoples.
Well, I recall when, I mean, if you read the news recently about the youth in Alice Springs and you know, off the street, lock them up, that fervour that is there was there when I was a kid, and it's still there today. And it's because of this contest of space, you know, contest to run a commercial operation with tourists and wanting to see this clinical view of Alice Springs and Central Australia and the desert and the white gum trees. They don't want to see Aboriginal kids. And there's this contest of space forever and a day that's happening in this town all the time. And in most remote towns, you will find that kids and on the street or Aboriginal people on the streets just doesn't mix with the view that they want to portray to the tourist. I mean, one of the things that you find also is that you are totally visible if you got $1 in your hand. You're totally invisible if you got nothing. They just ignore you. They don't care if you're starving in the streets or whatever. And that's the way commerce is run. It's about the dollar at all costs. Who cares about the kids going to putting on a conveyor belt that leads directly to jail? You know, who cares about that when you're making $1 out of tourists? You know, it's that contest of space of being Aboriginal. I mean, I had that argument the other day with someone. I said, well, the kids were here before the tourists. Let's be real, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to have to wrap up in a second, but I think what I am seeing, even in my own lifetime, is the shift where the blinkers are coming off people, and where people are starting to move into a space of bravery where they're challenging their own thoughts and ideas and understandings. But more than that, a development of our societal empathy that is giving people the ability to kind of take a step back and the desire to see from another person's perspective that hasn't been done before in Australian society since colonisation, where people are willing to sit down and listen rather than kind of go at it with the assumptions and with the questions.